Hello and welcome to this video on how to prepare yourself for your GCSE MFL exams. Obviously I'm speaking primarily to students, but I would like to also come through the lens of parents and carers at home who are looking to support their children in the revision for the MFL GCSE exam. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not a native speaker and my parents most certainly weren't either. So a lot of these strategies I've had to use myself as I've been setting myself up in the past for my GCSE exam. So hopefully they'll be helpful to you as students in order to revise for your exams, but also for parents and carers. Now, and talk about all of the strategies in the world, but what I think is most important more than anything else to start off with is ensure that you are creating the right conditions for your revision. So what you want to make sure is that you've got a clear desk. You need to have a clean space to avoid any distractions and so you know where everything is. The next thing is you want a quiet space. Some of the students that I teach, I know, for instance, they go to the local library to revise because there's a guaranteed quiet space with some clean desks that they can use. Other people might want to use their school library or a classroom in the school. Whatever works for you, just make sure it's a quiet space and that it's clean. And the last thing, mobile phones. If I were you, I would keep it well out of sight and use it as a reward for when you have a little bit of time off between revision sessions. If you struggle to do that, if you struggle to take yourself away from your mobile phone, you might want to give it to a trusted adult, a parent or a carer, or even a sibling. And the same parents and carers, this is something that I would definitely advise you just to consider when your children are revising, is having their mobile phones away, taking them out of sight, and the same with social media as well, because it can really split their attention and they're not going to get the optimal learning conditions that they need to really focus their attention for their revision. The next thing you want to do is you want to look at some key revision terms. So the first one is retrieval practice. Retrieval practice, I think, is what everyone would know as traditional revision. So it's about bringing old material back to the forefront of our minds, and it's all about making that process active. So some people might use cue cards to help them do that. Some people might use look, cover, write, check to help them do that. Some people might try and dump it all down in a knowledge dump, or some people might want to put it down in a spider diagram. Coupled with that is space practice. Space practice, for instance, you might cover a set of vocabulary in your class on school in 1 week. The next week you might revisit that same section of vocabulary in a little test, and then you might come across it again 3 weeks later on after that. So what you do with space practice is you learn something, you allow yourself some time to forget it, and then just as you're about to forget it, you bring it back to the forefront of your mind. And the last thing is interleaving. Interleaving, the best example I can give you of interleaving is in, for instance, a written task, a 90-word task. You might have a bullet point on school, which belongs to theme 3, so describe your school. And one of the other bullet points might be, what did you do with your friends last week? That comes from theme 1. So my first big bit of advice, I guess, really is just make sure you know your way around the materials that your teachers have given you. So, for instance, if you use a textbook, do you know where the glossaries are for the vocabulary? Because you need to be getting a good coverage of all of the themes in order to really start boosting your breadth of vocabulary for when you come to that reading and listening exam. Also, do you know where the grammar section is as well? Because you need to go back over your grammar, you need to go back over your tenses, how they translate back into English, and their endings. So knowing where that information is going to help you be independent in your revision and help your child be independent in the revision. And for parents, if you know where that glossary is, you can help guide your child to learn a set of vocabulary. Now, when you're learning vocabulary, the first thing when people think of revision for MFL, they think of vocabulary learning. Well, there's 2 ways in which we use vocabulary. The first one is we know a word passively. This means that if we read the word comer, that if we know that it means to eat in English, that means I passively know that word. The difference between passive and active vocabulary is that actively, I can use that in a piece of writing or I can use that in a piece of speaking. So for instance, if I know quiero comer patatas fritas, because I can use that word comer in a sentence when I'm speaking, that means I actively know that word. In terms of learning vocabulary and actively learning vocabulary, the first thing I would do is I would start by learning the word passively. So what I would do is I would cover up the English, I would go down a set of vocabulary, read out the Spanish and see if I knew that word in English. If I did, I would move on or maybe give it a tick, and if I didn't, I would highlight it. So I know to focus my attention on that. Once I've gone through the vocab and I'm happy with it passively, what I would then do is I would try and learn it actively. I would turn to the glossary, I would look at the English translation and say that in my head. I would then take my hand and cover the word in Spanish or in French. And once I've done that, I would try and say the Spanish and the French, and then I would take my hand off and look to see if I were right or if I were wrong. If I were right, I would maybe give it a little tick and pencil next to it. If I were wrong, I would put a little star next to it, so I know that I need to really force myself to learn that again. Once I've done that, I would repeat that process, focusing specifically on the ones that I did not know. Key caveat to that: if you use the textbook that I do, then the vocabulary for module 1 is over 2 pages, and no way in a 20-minute, 30-minute burst of revision are you going to learn all of that vocabulary. So pick a manageable chunk. So what I would do is I would pick maybe one section like I've highlighted on there. What you could do is you can do that independently, but you could also involve a parent or a carer and simply ask them to pick you a word, say the word in English, and you give them it in Spanish. Even if they don't know, they should be able to pick up the first letter that it starts with. And if you can do that, it's probably going to be on the right track. So parents and carers can really support you in this. My do's and don'ts for vocabulary learning. The first thing, do jump from module to module. So you can see I've picked one little small section from module 1. The next time I do some vocabulary learning, I might go to module 2. And the reason why I would do this is so that you're getting a lovely spread of a wide spread of vocabulary across different themes, across different units. What you don't want to do is focus on one module, because you're not going to get the breadth of vocabulary that you need in that exam. Now, another way that people learn vocabulary is through flashcards. So what you might want to do is you might want to give the Spanish on one side, give the English equivalent on the back, give it a title, and you might want to group them. Think about grouping them. So for instance, the ones that I've got on the screen now, they're all sports. So you might want to group them in sports. You might want to group the sports with sports that take jugar, to play. They might want to group them with sports that take hacer, to do. For flashcards, what I would do is I would arrange by topics and similar words. So for instance, you might want to have to play football, to play tennis, so they're all using the same verb, jugar. You want to give yourself a little prompt as well, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to put too much information on one card. So keep your flashcards small, condensed. When you use your flashcards to test yourself, what you want to do is you want to look at the Spanish, see if you can translate it into English first, then flip it over, give yourself the English, try and see if you can say the Spanish. And what the good thing to do is to create 2 piles. A pile of cards that you know, and a pile of cards that you don't know, or that you forgot some of the terms. And then what you're going to do is take the pile that you don't know and recover those, so that you go back over them again and make that active, conscious effort to learn that vocabulary. So my key advice for vocab learning is you want to do maybe 20-30-minute bursts, but really, really mix up the modules and topics so you're getting a good spread of vocabulary. The reading and listening exams, we've talked about vocabulary, which is really important for these 2 exams, but there's always going to be vocabulary that you're not going to know on that exam paper. And it's really important that you deploy strategies that are going to help you to decode that information. Decoding is where you unpick a word that you don't know and you try to work out its meaning. Things that I would do, first things first, sound out the word. So if we look at, for instance, cualidad, I know that sounds very similar to quality, and it actually means quality. Fisioterapeuta sounds like a physiotherapist. And the last one at the bottom there, beginning with O-E-S-T-E, it looks really strange. It looks like no other word in English, but when you actually pronounce it, oeste, it sounds very similar to west. So using that sounding out strategy, really important. The second strategy is I would look at the word itself and think, is there any links to English? So if we look at comentario, that means a comment, and you can see that comment in it. So look at the links to English. The third strategy is morphology. I think morphology is really, really important. Morphology is all about how you break down words. And you break the word into a prefix, suffix, and look at the middle, the root. So if I give you an example, for instance, if we take the word pescaderia, which you can see on strategy for word families, I know that pesc is to do with fish. I know that the suffix area is a shop, or often is a shop that sells fish, a fishmonger's. So you can build up information by using morphology, by looking at words, thinking about what suffixes, what prefixes can you find, and what is the root of that word. Now, key advice, if you do a listening exam, if you do a reading, always go back through, pull apart the vocabulary and look it up. See if you can practice some of those strategies when you're doing it as well. So if there's a word that you maybe missed, look at it again by breaking it down into prefixes, suffixes, and linking it back to other words that you might have already met. And if you do a listening, always use the transcripts as well. Ask your teacher to provide you with a transcript so you can physically see the words that were said to you. Tenses are essential, I would say, more than anything else for success in GCSE Spanish and French. Because if you make an issue with a tense in a speaking exam or in a writing exam, it can often cost you marks. So you need to know them inside out. What you can do is you can use tense tables, and you can use the look cover check method with those. Or what a lot of my students do is create tense cue cards. And the way in which they do these is they put the name of the tense on the front, and they'll put regular verbs. And on the flip side, they'll give me the translation back into English. So if we take the preterite tense, for instance, it's I played. They give me that translation and they write down the endings on the back of that card. They would do the same for the irregular verbs, and then they would do the same for other tenses. So instead of having the preterite tense, they might go on to the imperfect tense, which is different because it's not I played, it's I was playing or I used to play, and do that same process. And just like with your vocabulary, what they do is they would look at the name of the tense, they would try and say the endings on the back, or they would try and write the endings out on the back, flip it over, check their answers. If it was right, they put it in the correct pile or the no pile. And if it's wrong, they put in the don't know pile, and they would go over and really force themselves to learn those endings. Now, my key advice for this, again, short bursts, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and really go over previous tenses that you mightn't have met in a long time. The last thing is online exam skill tutorials. These are tutorials that I've put together that explain how each section of the writing exam and the speaking exam works. Knowing the exam strategies that you need to deploy, or what we call metacognition, is really, really important. So how we go about approaching those questions, because obviously I teach you all the vocabulary in the world. Native speakers can know all the vocabulary in the world, but for instance, if they prepare the photo card wrong, if they use too few verbs, they're going to lose themselves marks. So you need to know as well how the exam sections function. So using these online skills tutorials, really, really useful. If you've got a device, obviously you can just scan them from here and zap them. In terms of for your speaking exam as well, what I would do is prepare speaking cue cards. So if you've got a list of questions that your teacher's given you that you need to prepare, put the question on the front. What you want to do is write your example out on the back. And what you can do is you can read the question, try and see your example. Where you get stuck, a parent, a carer, or a sibling or a friend can make a note of the words that are tripping you up. They can physically write them down for you. And then what I would do is on the front, give yourself those as cues. And that's going to help you to remember them. In terms of online skills and also the speaking flashcards, you want to revisit all your cards regularly, short bursts again, and don't focus all your attention on one module, because during the course of the speaking exam, you have to cover every single theme that you've studied. Theme 1, Theme 2, Theme 3. So I hope that's been useful. I think there's a lot of things that parents and carers can do to support their children. I hope this has given you some strategies to help support your child. And if you are a student, think about the vocabulary, think about knowing your way around, think about the conditions that you're setting yourself in to work. They are all going to impact the effectiveness of your revision. Lastly, I wish you really, really good luck with your exams.